this was quite a night for the Democrats. It was quite a wake-up call for the Republicans. What Zohran Mamdani tapped into is affordability. Can you afford to live right now in America?
We've all wondered, as you said right at the beginning, where does the fight back start? What is the fight? What does it look like? What shape does it take? This is the fight back now.
Who knows? We'll see what he's able to pull off. But it absolutely chimed with a section of the poorer electorate who feel that the Democratic Party has not spoken enough about those issues in the past, and actually he tapped into that, and you can be on the left or the right of the Democratic Party and still do the same.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily. And the big one, the big talking point of today's episode will, of course, be that Mamdani win in New York. But I do want to talk, first of all, about the other successes that the Democrats have seen. And I think there's always a risk that on an election night, you start sort of leaning into something that feels like a political earthquake, when actually, if you step back, you say there are a lot of places where the Democrats were probably always going to have a pretty decent chance of victory. But something has happened when you look overnight at success for the Democrats in Virginia, where they've got their first female governor, success for the Democrats in New Jersey, which many people will think of as being a Democrat-leaning state, but this was actually a pretty tight bellwether race itself, for success for the Democrats in the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, where there were 3 more gains there. And critically, actually, something that we will talk about a little bit later, which is success for Gavin Newsom's Democrats in California with his Proposition 50. All that is to come. But let us first start with the race in New York and what it tells us, or what is it is in danger of making us think.
Yeah, and look, it was absolutely sweeping gains for the Democrats last night. And to put this into context, it was a year ago that America had gone to the polls and voted for Donald Trump. And for the past year, people have been saying, I'm trying to find a pulse in the Democratic body, but I can't actually find a pulse. I think it's clinically dead. Well, now we hear its heart is thumping. And it's about how much we read into that success that the Democrats have had that I think we're going to try and sort of kind of look into. Look, it's always the case that in off years, Donald Trump's name wasn't on the ballot. You know, the opposition party tends to do better. The governing party has a record to defend. People are a bit pissed off that they haven't seen the gains that they wanted. But more than that, these swings to the Democrats were bigger. And of course, as you say, Zohran Mamdani, socialist, Muslim, 34 years old, you know, all these kind of unique features, incredibly charismatic, has won. And does that mean the Democratic Party has to go left, or is it about personality, or is it about generation? And these are the things that I think we're going to spend a bit of time unpacking.
Yeah. And I guess it's easy, you know, to take away your headline as saying, the Dems have got to go left, they've got to go socialist, they've got to go progressive, they haven't had this kind of energy before. That's what it means. I would put the reins on that thought slightly. And what do I mean by that? Mamdani did incredibly well. It was incredibly charismatic the way he ran that race, and he got turnout out astonishingly. I mean, there's one statistic which I think is worth looking at. 2 million people came out to vote in New York. Andrew Cuomo, who was the former governor of New York, the disgraced sort of former Democrat.
He was the former governor of New York State.
Exactly.
And this was for the city, yeah.
So he actually got nearly 900,000 votes, which in any other race would have been enough to win him the mayoralty of New York City. This time round, so many more people came out, in other words, energised by what they saw as a sort of brand new feel to this race, that Mamdani won, and won very comfortably. But what I would say is, if you look at some of the other races that we just started to talk about, Abigail Spanberger, who is the Virginia governor-elect, comes from a totally different wing of the party. She's what they call a sort of security mom. In other words, she appeals to suburban Republican women. She's former CIA. She's a former CIA officer in Virginia, and she has a very different approach, I think, to politics. It feels slightly quieter, more consensual. She's very good at reaching across the aisle. She isn't sort of scary socialism or whatever people think of as, scary socialism. She's something that feels much more aligned with many Republican voices as well. She won astonishingly in Virginia. She was winning counties like Chester County, which Glenn Youngkin won as the governor 4 years ago. He won them by 5%. She won it by 17%. In other words, the kind of gains that she has made throughout Virginia have put the Democrats into a whole new space. And importantly, she's winning amongst non-whites, non-college educated by 87%. In other words, that whole trend of people that we saw going to Trump this time last year, what happened to them? Young black men. Did they go towards her in Virginia? Did they just stay at home? Do they think, well, if Trump's not on the ballot, it's not worth it. He's the name that I go out to vote for, or not at all. And obviously, these are very, very different areas. Virginia is not New York. New Jersey is not Virginia. Yeah. And you have to sort of put it in the context of these are individual sort of empires and individual countries. That's really important. But all I'm trying to say is it doesn't necessarily mean that the Democrats should all be thinking socialism is the way forward now. What it does mean is that energy is the way forward. Charisma is the way forward. Bravery, actually, is the way forward.
So I think there are two other things I would add to that. I agree with that completely. There are two other things that I think really came out of last night. One, generational.
Yeah.
The Democrats, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago sitting in a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and there was a Democrat senator, late Dianne Feinstein, who was in her late 80s. She had a dog on her lap. She was still in the Senate, one of 100 senators, and she was not there. I mean, honestly, she was not there.
The dog was, but she wasn't.
The dog was, she wasn't. You've got Joe Biden, who wouldn't leave the race and had to be forced out. You've got Chuck Schumer, still the Senate minority leader. There are still all these old septuagenarian, octogenarian, nonagenarian politicians whose time has been and gone. And I think that the generational shift that the Democratic Party needs to go through now is profound, because there are an awful lot of old codgers in politics who need to be put out to pasture. That's the first thing that I think we learned from last night. The other thing, and this is not so much about socialism, but it is about policy in some ways. What Zohran Mamdani tapped into, and I think other Democrats can do it, even whether they're on the left or on the right, is affordability. Can you afford to live right now in America? And that the concerns that these young people have, generation rent or whatever it happens to be, are real. And so when you see Mamdani, now look, whether he'll be able to deliver on the free buses and childcare and, subsidised kind of grocery stores, who knows? We'll see what he's able to pull off. But it absolutely chimed with a section of the poorer electorate who feel that the Democratic Party has not spoken enough about those issues in the past, and actually he tapped into that, and you can be on the left or the right of the Democratic Party and still do the same.
And he appealed to the mixed nature of New York. That was absolutely fundamental to the speech he made. Let's just play you this clip.
New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants, and as of tonight, led by an immigrant.
That is a city where you will hear Muslim voices saying, we have carried the scars of 9/11 accusation on our shoulders for decades. After 9/11, obviously destroyed by Islamist terrorists, there have been many Muslims who felt we're not welcome here. We're not part of this setup. And some, to the point where some have left, some have thought this is not an easy place to live. And it is almost like Mamdani has brought it full circle. Now, I should also say in the same breath that there are going to be Jewish New Yorkers, many of whom did vote for for Mamdani, but there will be other Jewish New Yorkers who feel nervous about what he's offering, the prospect of him, not because he's Muslim, but because he hasn't properly shut down certain things that have sort of pursued him, this idea of global intifada, not his phrase, somebody else's, but he hasn't distanced himself. I think there was a moment where the release of the hostages was not recognised by him, and that was something that people felt, well, actually, it might be Trump's work, but it is an amazing day. You should be going out, you should be saying that. And there is a moment in that same speech where Mamdani speaks to the Jews of New York, or at least to all those who fear anti-Semitism as resurgent in New York, and he makes very clear that he wants to bring all those sides together. I mean, I think for some, genuinely, that the verdict will be slightly out on how comfortable they feel, not about his Muslim religion, but about his identity vis-a-vis Israel and what happens next.
Yeah, and I think that's a very real concern in a city that has a very high Jewish population, and the traditional politics of the United States has been to be incredibly pro-Israel, and he is an important signifier of the shift in attitudes towards Israel that you can now see, and it's tearing the MAGA base apart as well. So it's not just confined to liberal New York. On the MAGA kind of right, it's a very live issue too. I thought that what he's done, though, and I'm going to use the word deliberately, he's brought back hope. And that word hope...
Oh, where did you get that one from?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that word hope is associated with Obama. And it was, not in policy terms necessarily, but in charisma, in energy, in that ability to kind of put 1,000 watts into the room and just light it up brightly. He has floodlit the political scene with this kind of raw energy, enthusiasm, charisma, oratorical brilliance. That is that we last saw with Obama.
Okay, and if we're going all in on hope, I'm going to bring in audacity.
Yeah.
Because why not? And I do think actually that's an important part of the recipe that the Dems have found this time round, which is say what you mean and do what you say. And I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, Gavin Newsom with this Proposition 50. Now, this will take a moment to explain for those of you who kind of find the whole jargon slightly disorientating, but it was something we began discussing back in the summer in August. And it was after Trump began redistricting congressional seats in Texas in order to give the Republicans more chances of winning and retaining the House next time round. And he basically gerrymandered certain seats to make it much more easy for Republicans to win. And the response from many Democrats was, this is outrageous, we must stop it, we must undo it. And the response from Gavin Newsom in California was, well, if you're doing that, then I'm going to do that. And he didn't change the seats, he didn't change the congressional districts, but he put on the map the idea that if Texas went ahead, if Trump went ahead, he would offer California the same response. And it was an overwhelming win last night. In fact, once the polls closed, I think the result in favour of Prop 50 came through within a minute. In other words, there were queues around the block of Californians saying, yes, please. Now, that was a gamble from Newsom. That's why I use the word audacious. I mean, obviously part of the Obama setup, but it was a gamble because people could have turned to him and said, oh, really? You're going to go dirty? Do you really want to do dirty politics? Are you becoming a new Trump? I actually thought that back in the summer, and I was proved wrong. And I think it finally puts to bed the Michelle Obama beautifully optimistic but slightly old-fashioned idea of 2016, which was when they go low, we go high. No, doesn't work. Gavin Newsom has, in his own way, said, when they go low, we find a way to beat them at their own game. And that's what he's doing. And I think he's just put himself in pole position now to be a very possible Democratic nominee for president. And I say that because what happened last year with the sort of endorsement, the coronation of Kamala, was that the Democrats were essentially denied the primary. There was no sense of asking the party through all the Biden years and after who they wanted as their Democrat at the top of the ticket. We didn't have that. We didn't get to see Kamala versus Newsom versus Gretchen Whitmer versus, a Mamdani-like figure versus AOC. And I think all these races are showing us that Democrats are finally having their choice of what the people look like that they can imagine representing them at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, I'm sure people listening will still wonder about what this redistricting looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got a city which has got, say, a high black population, and instead of those votes being split among, I don't know, 5 different constituencies where you might get a Democrat, you create one black super constituency, which will be kind of 85% Democrat, but all the suburban seats then are white and they will remain Republican. And so in Texas, what you've got Greg Abbott trying to do is to create a situation where he carves out an additional 8 or 9 Republican seats that will, when the House of Representatives is up for election next year, will go Republican. Yeah. And Gavin Newsom is doing the same. It is exactly when they go low, we go low.
But what he's,
and maybe even lower.
Yeah, but what he's done actually is on the back of that victory, he's now laid down a challenge for other states to do the same. He's called on Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, other Democratic-led states to follow him. In other words, yes, it's a pattern when Trump does it, but it can be a pattern of response. And I think that's what you're seeing now. I mean, it's funny, it's kind of a hairs on the back of the neck moment a little bit, because we've all wondered, as you said right at the beginning, where does the fight back start? What is the fight? What does it look like? What shape does it take? This is the fight back now. This is Newsom saying, this is the plan. This is the proposition. This is what you have to do. You cannot just sit there whilst your states are gerrymandered, whilst your seats are stolen, whilst your elections are rigged. This is what it means to take back that fight. And it's not just about California. And it's not just about, I think, his presidential ambitions in 2 years' time, 3 years' time. It's also about a blueprint for other democratic states to work out how to deal with Trump, how to deal with an undemocratic system.
And there's a part of it that leaves me feeling deeply uncomfortable, that what you're doing with is screwing with the machinery of democracy.
It's been screwed with.
I know it has, but this is a sort of, it's so low. And where does it end? That if you can endlessly
you move to the place where you want to vote.
I mean, people have said, oh, will Trump cancel the midterm elections? No, of course he won't cancel the midterm elections. People who are good at this sort of shit don't need to cancel the elections. They make sure they're going to win them. And the gerrymandering is part of that. And then you get gerrymandering on the other side, in California or Illinois or Maryland or wherever you say that they're being asked to consider this stuff. And you think, is this the way forward? Because ultimately you'll end up with one really powerful person who completely wrecks the whole machinery of it. And I think Donald Trump has come close to that, but it's not a great... I mean, I think, you'd love the idea that the elections will be won on the power of ideas, whether Zohran Mamdani's or someone else's, and not because you fiddled the
well,
seats.
Maybe that's where the Obama comparisons end, because he did Hope and Change and the Son of Immigrants and the reunification of America from a place of optimism. I think a lot of these guys are doing it from a place of absolute desperation.
Yes, and no more blue states, no more red states, just the United States. No, America is blue states and red states, and we're going to fight like hell within those states. That's the change that there is from the kind of optimism and idealism of the Obama period to today. I also think just worth dwelling on, we've talked about the Democrat successes, what we should glean from it. I think we also ought to talk about the Republican Party, which, yes, Donald Trump was very fast, as you would expect, to put out on Truth Social. The explanation for all of this is my name wasn't on the ballot. If obviously I'd been there, we'd have done much, much better. Yeah. And maybe they would have done. But there are real issues there now for the Republican Party. The government shutdown has gone on, and they haven't succeeded in blaming the Democrats for it. There are all sorts of concerns.
The success in Virginia, which is most hurt, or would be most hurt, lots of federal workers adjacent to DC. There are lots of people who haven't been at work for the last month. If they'd wanted to blame the Democrats, it would have been felt, I think, in that race. There.
Exactly. And you've also got cost of living concerns that are still there. And for all that Donald Trump is telling everybody every day that America keeps on winning and the like, the fact of the matter is, I think an awful lot of people are still struggling and thinking, where is this miracle, Donald, that you promised us?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about his name on the ballot is really interesting, isn't it? Because do you remember when there was it 2018, where they were expecting the big surge, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The big red surge, it didn't happen. And he said, oh, my name's not on the ballot. Now, in a normal world, Donald Trump's name would never be on the ballot again. Right? This is his second time as president.
Yep.
He's not on the ballot for the midterms.
No.
And so you have to get used to a world, I think, in which Donald Trump's name never appears on a ballot again, unless, of course, it does.
Well, Donald Trump has sort of now said, I mean, insofar as Donald Trump ever kind of rules out anything, he has sort of ruled out that he's going to try and run again. And he does accept there is this thing called the 22nd Amendment that you can only serve 2 terms. So in that sense, I can't foresee the circumstances in which Trump's name appears on the ballot again. It would go to the Supreme Court. Surely the Supreme Court would have to say that is
But who is the name
unconstitutional.
then the Republicans need to... Because this is...
There's nobody that's got the firepower of Trump. There's nobody on the Republican side. I mean, look, J.D. Vance has got a profile, and, Marco Rubio has got a profile, and Donald Trump Jr. has got a profile. And there are, other Republicans as well who would look at themselves in the mirror and think, oh, I could be president. But no one has the ability to get people to... Donald Trump did get people who'd gone off the grid to come and vote in elections. And that was unique to him.
I agree. And I will repeat, the elections that we're looking at today, whether it's New York, whether it's Virginia, whether it's New Jersey, there's even, I'm just reading about Eastern Long Island, where very Trumpy candidates have actually gone Dem. But these are all places where it is fairly safe Democratic territory. We're not talking about elections in Alabama. We're not talking about elections, in Texas. We're not talking about elections even in Florida now. And of course, if we were, I'm sure the map would start looking very different. But it does feel like at this point, on a sort of sleepless post-election Wednesday, the Democrats are starting to find their voice, find their feet, find their fight back. And it's hard to see how in a year's time it will be the Democrats going backwards and not the Republicans. Now, obviously, a year is a massively long time. Caveat, caveat, caveat. But if this is why I keep saying that's what the blueprint looks like. Because it's about personality, it's about charisma, it's about audacity, it's about optimism. And then it's about everything else that Trump is doing that is really going down badly, whether it is, as you say, affordability, the prices of things, the price of groceries, whether it's about ice on the streets, whether it's about shutting down free speech, whether it's about Elon Musk trying to, commandeer elections to his own sort of world. These are all things that I think his own polls are really bad now, right?
Yeah, look, let us not read too much into last night. Let us not say this is all sewn up. Democrats have got the White House in 2028. That would be absolutely preposterous to be saying that on the basis of last night. But it's not nothing either. This was quite a night for the Democrats. It was quite a wake-up call for the Republicans. And I think for the Democrats, a rediscovery of mojo can't come a moment too soon.
Too soon.
Mojo too soon. Given how shockingly they performed in last year's presidential election, and given the sort of listless way they have responded to it until now, when they seem to have suddenly found, we do know how to win after all. And that muscle memory has come back to them of, we can do this sort of shit. And so it's not all done and dusted, but my God, last night was significant as well.
Before we go, it's always interesting to listen to the speech that a victor makes on the night. And I guess a lot of people might have been expecting Mamdani to be a bit more acquiescent, a bit more generous to his foes. But no, he stuck the boot in to Andrew Cuomo straight away in the first minute of his speech. And this was his message for the man who would have been mayor.
My friends, we have toppled a political dynasty. I wish Andrew Cuomo only the best in private life. But let tonight be the final time I utter his name. answers only to the few. New York, tonight you have delivered a mandate for change. A mandate for a new kind of politics. A mandate for a city we can afford. And a mandate for a government that delivers exactly that.
Okay, he doesn't ever want to talk about him again. I think this is the new spirit of politics, and this is probably borrowed from Trump, which is like, well, say it. Say what you mean. Tell us what you mean.
Yeah, exactly.
The very end of his speech, he signs off with one of the best known political phrases in the world, which is, "We campaigned in poetry, will govern in prose," which is borrowed, of course, from Andrew Cuomo's own dad, Mario Cuomo, who was governor of New York. I feel like that's the sort of ultimate insult. It's like, your dad was good, you're
Well, an amazing night in New York, and as you say, that end of the speech from Mamdani, where he's more or less dancing on the grave of Andrew Cuomo, saying, "I'm never going to see your name again. You know, good luck with your private life, but just don't ever think you're entering public life again." It was very different. Look, in a moment, we're going to be talking about another very controversial figure in American public life, the former Vice President Dick Cheney, whose death was announced this week. We're going to be talking to a former long-time staffer and friend of his in just a moment. Dick Cheney, whose death was announced this week, the former Vice President, who was a giant of American Republican politics for decades, going right the way back to Gerald Ford when he was president after Richard Nixon. But if it's true that in politics you're only ever remembered for one thing, I suspect with Dick Cheney it will be his support for the Iraq War and the consequences that flowed from it.
I think he will be remembered for leading the US into the war with Iraq. That was 22 years ago. But I also think he provides, if you like, a bellwether for the movement of the Republican Party past him. What do I mean by that? He epitomised the sort of neocon movement at Bush's side during the Second Gulf War. But latterly, his last vote alive in a presidential election was for Kamala Harris. He voted for a Liberal. He voted for a Democrat. He was so against Trump. He called him a coward and a threat to democracy. And you have to decide, I guess, in your head whether Cheney moved and morphed or whether the party around him sort of flowed past him and became something totally different. I mean, he was the man that anti-war Democrats used to call Darth Vader. And he was the man whose daughter, Liz Cheney, emerged as the strongest, most vocal, brave Trump antagonist. Actually, she took the fight to Trump after the January 6th efforts to overturn the election results, and he stood by her. And maybe through her or because of her or around her, he came to the same conclusions about Trump that she did.
Look, what you have, and Emily, you and I, over the course of many, many podcasts, have talked about sort of the cowardice of so many Republicans to stand up to Donald Trump. Here you have a constitutionalist. Here you have someone who believes in the US Constitution and the sanctity of that document and playing by the rules and upholding the rules of democracy, the free and fair, transfer of power after an election. And there were an awful lot of Republicans who kind of thought it was expedient, it would serve their careers best to go along with whatever it was that Donald Trump wanted. So in later life, I think there was something of a political rehabilitation for Dick Cheney when he was seen. You might not like his policies, but he was a man of principle who upheld the rules of the Constitution. And I think that serves him very well. And people will continue to argue about Iraq, what happened.
And they should. I mean, I think, the ill-fated war on Iraq can be laid pretty much directly at Cheney and those around him. Bush, Rumsfeld. I mean, those were the architects of a war that probably should never have been fought. And I don't think that you have to forget that in order to say he was both of those things.
But there was also let me put the argument, and I know people will disagree with this. There was a certain nobility to the argument, which was about the idea that we could spread democracy around the world. We could make it our great gift to the world that we will export ideas of liberal democracy to places like Iraq. Now, of course, we now know that that has not exactly been a stunning success, but I think there was an idealism as well around in 2002, 2003. Blair was articulating it, Bush was articulating it, so there was that view that we could do something and make the world a better place with the force of our ideas.
Yeah, I guess that's pre-Arab Spring, pre-uprising.
Yeah.
Right? There was a belief that actually democracies like the US had things to teach the rest of the world.
Well, let's speak to our old friend Ron Christie, who served in the Bush White House, who was a long-time colleague of Dick Cheney. And Ron, thank you so much for being with us today. Obviously, it's a personal loss that I'm sure you are feeling right now. There is a public perception of Dick Cheney, which was, as Emily said a moment ago, the sort of Darth Vader, or it's kind of evil figure who controlled everything. Does that square with the man you know?
No, it doesn't. And John, Emily, it's been a long time. Good to see you, my friends. It's really a great opportunity for us to speak today. No, he wasn't Darth Vader. He was one of the kindest, most wittiest folks I've ever had the honor to know, let alone work for. And to work for Dick Cheney for the better part of a year and a half, and to have been candidly part of his family for the last 25, almost 30 years, has been a blessing for me. I mean, it really has been. He has really been a great mentor to me.
And Ron, just put him in context for us, because I guess some of our older listeners will remember Dick Cheney's role in leading America into the Iraq War. And some of our younger listeners will think of him as the father of Liz Cheney and her extraordinary fight against Trump, the fight to impeach him after that attempt to steal the election of 2000. Do you think that Cheney himself moved? Did he change in your eyes, or did the party just sail past him?
Emily, great question. I think the party sailed past him. I think that if you look at a George Bush or a Dick Cheney or a John Thune, the current Senate Majority Leader in the United States House of Representatives, I think the party has passed them by. And there's no such thing as a moderate anymore. And it's hard to believe if you go back 20 years that people thought that Bush and Cheney were moderates, or at least they tilted more toward the center. I think the Republican Party in the United States right now is so far to the right that it's unrecognizable of the party that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush presided over when they were in the White House.
Ron, I said kind of in the introduction that, if it's true in politics that you are remembered for just one thing, is Cheney going to be remembered for the Iraq War and some of the calamities that took place as a result afterwards?
John, I think so. I think, for better or worse, people are going to say that, he was Bush's brain, or he was, as we started off at the outset of the, puppeteer behind the scenes that led the United States into war against not only Iraq, but Afghanistan as well. Whether it's true or not, I think that's the perception that many Americans, older Emily, as you pointed out, will have. But younger folks might not sense that, but I believe that will be part of his legacy.
Yeah, well, hang on. You used the word puppeteer. Is that a correct characterization? Was he
No.
the brains behind the operation? Because we think, let me just finish with, Ron, we think of him as the most powerful vice president probably that there's ever been.
He's the man who gave the vice to Vice.
Yes, Emily, that is the case. Look, let me answer both of your questions. Was he the most powerful vice president of the United States, the 46th vice president? Yes, he was. Hands down, no question. Was he the puppeteer, the one, moving the strings behind the scenes? No. I worked for both men. I saw them both behind the curtain, if you will. But I will say that Dick Cheney, at least in the first term, not the second term, in the first term, had an outsized influence over President Bush's policies and how he sought to move the nation forward. But in the second term, I think that was remarkably diminished.
So what changed because of Iraq?
I think there were those, John, behind the scenes. And don't forget that Dick Cheney was Don Rumsfeld's deputy chief of staff. Cheney became the youngest White House chief of staff at 34. And Bush asked Cheney to fire Rumsfeld at the beginning of the second term. And it's interesting to me that I think Bush realized that his war strategy wasn't working. It was not leading to the results that we thought were going to happen in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I find it ironic that Bush made Cheney fire his mentor, which to me says a lot.
We hear very little from George W. Bush these days. I mean, really surprisingly little. Ron, I don't know whether you do or whether you are in touch at all, but have we heard from him since the death of Dick Cheney was announced? And would you like to see him playing more of a role now in the shaping of the Republican Party?
Well, Emily, I can say that I'm in the Executive Advisory Council of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. I probably see the president, if not once a month, every other month, perhaps. He put out a very lengthy statement yesterday about the passing of his vice president. I won't share with your audience. I will share this with you both offline of the funeral proceedings, which will be at the National Cathedral later this month. President Bush will be there. I think they had their differences at the end as it related to pardoning my former chief of staff, Scooter Libby. But ultimately, I believe that Bush honored the fact that he had Dick Cheney by his side.
And Ron, just a final question, because it's been a kind of fascinating night in US politics overnight. Zohran Mamdani, 34-year-old Muslim, elected mayor of New York, self-described socialist. I mean, look, you can read too much into these things and then you can ignore these things. How significant a night do you think it was for where the Republican Party is right now?
John, here's how I'd answer that. I wouldn't look at Zohran Mamdani in a vacuum. I'd look at Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey. I would look at the candidate who won, Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. I believe if the Democrats are going to have a turnaround, I think their turnaround started last night. New York City, obviously the biggest city in the United States, huge victory for the Democratic Socialist Party. But Democrats in New Jersey, Democrats in Virginia, Democrats down ballot.
And California, I guess, with Prop 50 in Newsom.
Prop 50. And to your viewers, Emily, Prop 50, which would redraw the congressional districts in the state of California to give the Democrats potentially upwards of 5 more seats in the United States House of Representatives. I think last night was a turnaround, I would say to you both. And I think the Republicans need to wake up and say, retro from my best Scooby-Doo rendition of what comes next.
Ron Christie, Scooby-Doo, fantastic to have you on our podcast.
Always a pleasure to
Thank you
both.
for joining us. And thanks for sharing it with us. I know it's all quite raw for you still, Ron, so really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Emily.
And we will be back next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents USA.